The room was never completely dark, even on the darkest of nights. There was always a hint of light from stars or the moon, or even a faint glow reflected from near and distant streetlights or the headlights from occasional passing cars. The consequence of this was that when dawn arrived, the increased light in the room was barely perceptible as it grew ever so slightly, ever so slowly. There was no defining moment where you could say that from this point on the room was light and previous to this it was dark. Rather than illuminating the room, the morning light had the effect of making the walls and ceiling shimmer and glow just slightly. But the increase was enough to signal her that it was time to wake. She arose from her bed with surprising grace and ease for a woman who was no longer young. She hadn't reached what one would have called old age, but certainly no one would have mistaken her for being the young woman she once was, juggling the demands of wife, motherhood, and career. It had taken judicious parsing of her time and efforts in order to be successful at all three, but she had done that. And at this point in time, her daughter was now several years into motherhood herself. She had regrets, of course. Everyone's a novice at life, and mistakes and false starts are an unfortunately too frequent part of everyone's experience. If we could only live our younger lives with the wisdom and confidence that we have when we're much older. She picked up the gauzy robe from the chair back where she had left it the night before and put it on over her nightgown. It wasn't really done out of a need for warmth. It just seemed to her that it would be appropriate to change her wardrobe, however slightly, to signify the change from sleeping to wakeful activity. She would allow herself the attire of nightgown and robe through the morning reading of the newspaper with coffee. She'd be seated at the small table at the window in her second-story bedroom from which, as the daylight increased, she'd be able to take in the view of the street below and much of the neighborhood. As the air warmed the old house, it would gently creak. This was a palindrome-like phenomenon, with the house making similar noises as the sunlight dimmed and the temperatures decreased in the evening. When she first moved into the house many years ago, the sounds of the hardwood floors creaking and popping sounded like another person, a possible intruder, stalking the far-off, unseen corridors. Eventually she got used to it, and it stopped worrying her. In fact, when she'd occasionally spent a night with friends or family who lived in newer homes, sounds of her creaking old house were absent. The morning newspaper and coffee. Her world would not be the same without this comforting ritual. It was a daily, intimate conversation between journalist and citizen. A bantering pair of on-air personalities on a flickering screen wasn't the same thing at all. She hoped that her own passing, surely many years in the future, would nevertheless occur prior to the demise of the daily printed newspaper delivered to your door anonymously in the night. There was probably a prior generation who had similarly expressed a desire to pass before the automobile displaced the horse and buggy, she realized. She loosely knotted the bathrobe and was about to head down the stairs to start her coffee maker and retrieve the newspaper when she saw her reflection in the mirror above the dresser. No makeup to accent her eyes or lips or even out the slight imperfections in her skin tone. She was getting to the point where she thought that using cosmetics to enhance her natural features was less and less important. Someday, she might just stop using them altogether. Through her genetic inheritance, she'd been given an attractive face and figure, and while she had a few crow's feet at the outer corners of her eyes, they seemed to be apparent mostly when she was smiling, and thus served to augment her pleasant disposition. This was further reinforced by a noticeable lack of frown lines. All in all, her face presented a fairly accurate external representation of her inner being. And her shoulder-length hair had only become half-streaked with gray and had just enough natural curl remaining so that her infrequent trips to the hairdresser were mainly for the purpose of trimming. Because of a natural preference, assisted by her conscientious upbringing, for healthy eating and a lack of antipathy toward moderate physical activity, in a pinch, she could probably still fit into her wedding dress without looking like a child being stuffed into an outfit it had clearly outgrown last year. As she started to turn away from the mirror, she noticed in the reflection her 3 framed photographs on the opposite wall. There was a black and white enlargement of her in cap and gown at her high school graduation, looking slightly self-conscious, with her beaming mother gazing at her with a sense of accomplishment. A job very well done indeed. To the side of this was the professional photographer's wedding portrait, taken some 6 years later, with the groom looking slightly uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo, with his hippie-era long hair and beard, while she wore the wedding dress she had sewn herself, with long, full ringlets of auburn hair cascading over her bare shoulders. No one sews anymore. When she was in junior high school, all the boys took woodshop and all the girls took home ec. These courses were not electives. The consequence of this was that while few of the boys from those days ended up in jobs making things out of wood, many of the men, nonetheless, ended up being handy with tools and spent the rest of their lives doing simple home repairs, while the current generations who's been spared this vocational training seems to be thoroughly befuddled by any repair that requires minimal dexterity with a screwdriver. Her own daughter occasionally brought her garments to be mended due to a total lack of sewing skill or knowledge. When she was in high school, she had sewn many of her outfits. Lots of girls did. It was kind of fun. And if you were not the wealthiest family on the block, it was a way to keep up with the demands of teenage fashion. Actually, she missed sewing. Hadn't done any significant sewing in years and years. When her daughter was first born, she made some of her child's play clothes for a few years, but eventually it was just too time-consuming. Maybe she could have continued if she'd been a stay-at-home mom, but at this point in her life, she was beginning to have a little more free time. Maybe when she retired a few years from now, she'd buy a mountain cabin, find an old treadle sewing machine, sit in a long dress fashioned from a madras bedspread, and do some sewing again. Fire glowing in the fireplace, a few candles and hurricane lamps hanging on the walls lighting the room. A big old yellow dog curled up nearby. Oh, it would have to be a Singer machine with the block lettering and intricate gold adornment. And the third photo, taken a mere 8 months later, was of her in a hospital gown, holding her just-born daughter to her chest, while her face remained streaked with the dried tears from a just-concluded difficult yet glorious childbirth. Each of these photographs represented for her a unique, once-in-a-lifetime, momentous event never to be re-experienced. With no canine companion to retrieve the newspaper for her, she descended the stairs, ventured a few steps out the front door to pick it up herself, and with coffee and paper in hand, she climbed the stairs to return to her bedroom table, where she peered out onto the street below. It was always quiet and serene at this time of day, but it hadn't always been like this. Many years ago, a half a century, 2/3 of a lifetime, it had been a gathering place for confrontations. First, there'd been the so-called free speech movement. But when that historical uprising was taking place, she had just transitioned from competing with her girlfriends in games of hopscotch and jacks to vying for the attention and affection of boys, while facing the daunting confusion of life in junior high school in the Sleepy Valley town where she was raised. But a half-dozen years later, after she had graduated and relocated to the immediate area to attend a university, when the streets were teeming with angry students, she had been at first a reluctant participant, with her commitment growing as the causes the protests were organized around transformed from student rights to civil rights, ecological rights, and finally even women's rights. The tumult of these early college days would be indelibly etched in her consciousness for the rest of her life. There was no section of the daily paper that was passed over. At a minimum, she at least glanced at every page and scanned the headline captions. Reporters and writers put considerable effort into their daily writing. She could at least pay them the compliment to scan what they had written. Even the sports section, in which she had little interest, was at least owed a few moments, if for no other reason than to familiarize herself with the names of the players, in case they were brought up in a conversation with coworkers, though most of her coworkers were not sports fans either. It wasn't necessary that she be able to join in when others were discussing who might be named to the All-Star team, but it would be polite to at least know whom they might be talking about. Same thing with reporting about television programs. She had little time or interest in most offerings on television these days, preferring a good book to entertain herself. But television was still an important part of the culture, and one should be able to keep up with the cultural references the medium was so busy spinning out. And those references might come in handy on a crossword puzzle someday. It was a Saturday morning, so she wouldn't have to be scurrying to ready herself for work. It would be a more leisurely tempo as she finished the newspaper and prepared for a day of running scheduled errands. That's how it goes when one is the vice president of a college. Monday through Friday is overscheduled with work-related activities, and only on the weekends does one have time to carry out the necessities of life. Trips to the grocery store, trips to the cleaners, trips to the post office to pick up mail that required a signature, and so forth. Later that afternoon, as she returned home, she found a letter in her mailbox that had the potential to bring significant change to her life. She was comfortable with her life as it was, but life does not change nor remain static in order to match the desires of its participants. Save the date, it said. The class of 1967 is holding its 50th reunion on...
My God, is it coming up to 50? I really hadn't considered going to any reunions, but I suppose one really must go to the 50th. It isn't like there's going to be another one of those. They are pretty much once-in-a-lifetime events. I wonder if he'll be there. I really haven't thought about him too much lately. We were quite close in high school, and we talked almost every day, it seemed like, in college. Then, as the years went on, we sort of lost touch with each other. I mean, we were both married to other people, and once you are married, it's hard to maintain a friendship with a person of the opposite sex. Spouses are never really comfortable with it, even if they claim it's okay, that they understand, that of course they trust you and all that. I don't think they ever really do. It's been a long time, a lot of years. I wonder what my Berkeley boy has been up to.
I've had a good life, some well-defined moments, always tried my best. Sure, I've had regrets. You could say that I wished a bit, hoped a lot, kissed a bit, loved a lot, laughed a bit, smiled a lot, danced a bit, and dreamed a lot. A novice at first, but hey, weren't we all then? And some friends were lost at no little cost. You could say that I heard a bit, saw a lot, taught a bit, learned a lot, played a bit, worked a lot, lost a bit, but I really lived a lot. I have few at all. Life is so serene, 50 years it's been. I hope my Berkeley boy's there.